Her hands smelled like flour before she could afford to buy it. That was how Renee Caldwell had always known herself. Not by the apartment she lived in, a two-bedroom on the third floor of a building where the elevator had been broken for 3 years, and the landlord returned every voicemail with a new excuse and a promise that was starting to look like it had never been a promise at all. Not by the rusted Civic she drove with the heat stuck on high even in June, so that she arrived at every destination in summer having baked the last 4 blocks. Not by the name badge she wore to the grocery store on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and sometimes Sunday mornings when she picked up extra shifts, because the Sunday morning differential was $2 more per hour, and $2 per hour multiplied across 4 hours was $8, and $8 was Cora's asthma medication 3 times over if Renee caught the right coupon. She knew herself by what she did with $4.87 when that was all that was left in her checking account after the electric bill and the school shoes and the co-pay for her daughter's inhaler. She went to the day-old rack at the back of Whitmore's bakery and she bought whatever they had. Not because she lacked pride, she had more pride than most people knew what to do with. She bought the day-old bread because it still tasted like bread, because her daughter, Cora, was 6 years old and growing, and a child who is growing needs toast in the morning and a sandwich at noon, and day-old sourdough does both those things just as well as anything fresh out of the oven. She had learned this before Cora was born, and she had not forgotten it. What Renee did not know on the Tuesday morning in February when her life changed in the bread aisle of Whitmore's was that the woman standing behind her had been watching her for 4 years. Not watching in the soft, neighbourly way of someone who lived nearby, watching in the careful way of someone who had a ledger running in the back of her mind and was still adding numbers to it. That woman was Diane Whitmore. She owned the bakery. She owned the building it sat in. She owned the mixed-use strip 2 blocks north, and she was in the process of acquiring the lot on the corner of 5th and Elm, where she planned to build a second location because one location was no longer enough for what Whitmore's had become. She had also, for the past 4 years, watched Renee Caldwell come to her day-old rack and pick up what was left. And she had never once said hello. If you have ever bought day-old bread, you know there is no shame in it. You know the math, and you know that a good loaf of sourdough at 40% off still tastes like a good loaf of sourdough. And you know that the person next to you in line is doing the same calculation you are, even if their cart is fuller. Most days Renee did not think about it at all. She picked up the bread, she checked the date, she put it in her basket, and she moved on. She had 5 other things to do before she picked Cora up from school. On that Tuesday in February, there were 2 other women at the day-old rack when she got there. Renee recognised one of them, a woman named Patrice from the building, and she nodded. The other was a woman she had never seen before, late 40s, a linen jacket that was too light for the weather, earrings that Renee could tell were real without being able to say how exactly. The woman in the linen jacket looked at the rack. She looked at Renee. She looked back at the rack with an expression that was not quite a sneer, but was not anything else either, and she said, to no one in particular, "I cannot believe they actually let people shop for expired food in the same store." Patrice made a small sound and took a half step back. Renee set down the loaf she was holding. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "It is day-old bread," Renee said. "It is not expired. And I have been shopping in this store for 4 years." The woman in the linen jacket looked at her for a long moment. "Well," she said, and the word was a door closing. She took a box of macarons from the display case and walked to the register. Renee stood there for 2 seconds, then she picked up the sourdough, picked up a seeded rye for Cora's lunches, and walked to the register herself. She was not going to let the moment cost her anything else. What she did not know was that Diane Whitmore had heard every word. Diane had come out of her office to check the morning pastry count, which she did every Tuesday, and she had stopped at the end of the aisle because she did not want to walk into whatever that was. She stood where she was, and she watched the woman in the linen jacket disappear around the corner, and then she watched Renee pick up the sourdough and the rye and carry them to the register. Diane owned a bakery. She had also, at one point in her life, bought day-old bread. That had been 31 years ago when she was 22 and newly widowed with a 3-month-old son she was raising in a 1-room apartment in this same neighbourhood, heating formula on a 2-burner stove and folding the bills she could not pay into the back of a drawer because she could not throw them away and could not face looking at them. She had not forgotten what the rack felt like. She had not forgotten the calculation, the particular arithmetic of choosing what was essential and letting everything else wait. And she hadn't forgotten the look on the face of the woman who had said something not so different from what she had just overheard. She did not walk over to Renee. She did not say anything. Did not. She went back to her pastry count, and she wrote down the numbers, and she thought about the ledger she had been keeping in the back of her mind for 4 years. The ledger was not formal. It was not written anywhere. It was the accumulation of small observations made across 4 years of a woman coming into her store and conducting herself with complete, quiet dignity in a space that was designed to cater to people with more money than she had. She never hurried through the store. She never apologized for being there. She read the labels carefully, checked the dates, chose what was useful, and left. She did not compare herself to the people around her with fuller carts. She did not carry her circumstances like a wound. She carried them like a fact, and the fact did not diminish her. And Diane had noticed this for 4 years without saying anything because she had been waiting to understand what exactly she was noticing. Now she understood. Renee did not think about any of this. She was running 3 minutes late for work. Cora was waiting at the window when Renee got home that night, the way she always was, the way Renee had been collecting as a private gift all 6 years of her daughter's life. The apartment smelled like the green beans Renee had put in the slow cooker before her shift, and Cora had already set the table with the good plates, meaning the ones without chips, which she arranged with the careful formality of someone who understood that some things deserved ceremony even on an ordinary Tuesday. Renee stood in the doorway for a moment and let herself feel it. "You're 4 minutes late," Cora said. She had recently learned to read a clock and was applying the skill aggressively. 4 minutes, Renee said. "I'll add it to what I owe you." They ate dinner, and Renee listened to Cora explain everything that had happened at school, which was considerable. There had been an incident involving a crayon and a girl named Destiny, and a disagreement about the colour of the sky that had required 2 teachers to resolve. Cora had opinions about the sky and about crayons, and she conveyed them with the passionate precision of someone who knew she was right. Renee did the dishes while Cora read to her from the book they were working through, a chapter at a time. The story of a girl who found a door in a library that led somewhere no library should have been able to contain. When Cora was asleep, Renee sat at the kitchen table with the notebook she kept for the things she was not yet ready to call a plan. She had been keeping the notebook for 2 years. Inside it were recipes. Not copied recipes, though she had her grandmother's biscuit formula, memorized so deeply it lived in her wrist, passed down from a woman who had never once measured anything but could tell by the weight of the dough when it was ready. Her own recipes. Things she had been working on alone in the kitchen after Cora went to sleep. Things she had tested and adjusted and tested again, flour and water and time and temperature and patience, applied in the small hours when the rest of the building was quiet and the only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the particular creak the oven made when it reached 250 degrees. There were 41 recipes in the notebook. 15 of them were breads. 11 were pastries. The rest were variations, experiments, a running argument she was having with fermentation that she fully intended to win. Some nights she tested until 1 in the morning. Some nights the test failed and she wrote a single note in the margin, 1 word or 2, a temperature adjustment, a different flour ratio, and she left the failed loaf on the counter and went to bed, knowing she would fix it Thursday. The notebook had no date on the cover. It had a small grease stain on the bottom right corner from the night she had been adjusting the honey wheat formula and knocked the measuring spoon. She had considered getting a new notebook and decided the grease stain was information. She had worked at the grocery store for 3 years. Before that, she had worked at a school cafeteria for 2 years, where she had learned a great deal about feeding large numbers of people quickly and nothing at all about feeding them well, though she had done what she could with what she had. And the kids at that school had eaten better on the days she worked than on the days she did not. And she knew this because 2 of the lunch monitors had told her so, and because she had trusted her own judgment enough to notice it herself. Before the cafeteria, she had been a baker's assistant at a small shop 2 neighborhoods over, a place called Hatch, run by a man named Gerald who had trained in Chicago and moved back to this city to be near his mother, and had stayed long after his mother passed because the neighborhood had become his. Gerald was the person who had first put a proofing schedule in front of Renee, and watched her read it and said, "You already know this, don't you?" Not a question. An observation. Renee had said she did not know she had just cooked a lot. Gerald had said those were the same thing if you paid attention, and she had understood what he meant. She had learned a great deal in that job, not the least of which was that she was better at the work than anyone who had trained her, and she had gone home the final day when Hatch closed because Gerald's landlord had tripled the rent and Gerald was 61 and tired, carrying her notebook and a deep certainty that she would have her own place someday, when the numbers were right. She had also carried a 12-page document Gerald had written out in his careful hand, every formula he used, every ratio that had taken him 20 years to settle, given to her with no ceremony, slid into her bag with a single comment. "You will use these right." She kept them folded in the back of the notebook. She had not copied them or used them in her own experiments because they were not hers to use. She kept them because Gerald had entrusted them to her, and she did not take entrusted things lightly. The numbers were not right. She knew that. Cora's inhaler cost $62 every time, and the school required a new physical in the fall, and the car needed front brakes, and none of these things could wait for someday. She was not a dreamer who could afford to pretend the math didn't matter. She was a person who bought day-old bread and made it taste like something, and she held the dream the way she held the notebook, quietly, without apology, as a thing that was hers and was waiting. She closed the notebook and went to bed. The next Tuesday, Renee went back to Whitmore's the way she always did. She had thought about Diane's offer once since it happened, briefly before she decided to think about it when she was standing in front of it, and not before. The day-old rack had 2 multigrain loaves and a bag of dinner rolls, and she took the multigrain and left the rolls. She was in the middle of calculating whether to also get the olive oil crackers when she realized someone was standing beside her. She looked up. It was Diane. Renee had seen her in the store before, but had never spoken to her. Diane was 53, shorter than she looked in photographs, and she had the direct, assessing gaze of someone who had made a great many decisions and had learned not to waste time getting to them. She was wearing a plain, dark sweater and sensible shoes, and nothing about her appearance announced what she owned. "My name is Diane," she said. "I know," Renee said. "I want to ask you something." She paused. "Last week, what you said to that woman, did you mean it?" Renee thought about it. "I meant all of it," she said. Diane studied her for a moment. "You've been shopping here for 4 years. About that, yes. I know your name is Renee. I know you have a daughter. I know you work at the store 3 days a week." She said it matter-of-factly. Not as a threat, not as a boast. She said it the way someone says a thing they have known for a long time and are finally saying out loud. "I should have said something before now." "Said what?" Renee said. Diane looked at the rack. She didn't look at it as though it were a sad thing or as though she were making a point about it. She looked at it the way she looked at everything in her store, with the assessing attention of someone who had built the thing she was looking at and wanted to see how it was holding up. "Come see me at the store next Tuesday," she said. "Bring something you made." She walked away before Renee could answer. Renee stood there for a moment. Then she picked up the olive oil crackers too and walked to the register. If Renee had told anyone what happened next, they would not have believed her. She was not sure she believed it herself, not during the days leading up to the next Tuesday, when she tested and retested the seeded dark rye she had been developing for the past 3 months, adjusting the water ratio by 4 grams until it was exactly right, proofing it overnight on the 3rd try, getting up at 5 in the morning to score it and slide it into the oven while Cora slept. She used the loaf pan she had owned since the school cafeteria years, a heavy one that held heat the way cast iron does, the corners slightly darkened from years of use. She had bought it second-hand, and it was the best piece of equipment she owned, and she had refused every suggestion Tamara had made over the years that she replace it. "Some things don't need replacing," Renee had said. Tamara had said that was the most Renee sentence she had ever heard. She wrapped the cooled loaf in a clean cloth and carried it on the bus to Whitmore's because the car's heater would have affected the crust, which she wanted to present at room temperature. This was the kind of decision that probably made her seem excessive to anyone watching. She did not care. She brought it to Whitmore's at 8 in the morning, still faintly warm in the cloth. Diane met her at the door and led her through to the kitchen in the back, which Renee had never seen before. It was larger than she had imagined. Cleaner, with the specific kind of order that belongs to a place where work is taken seriously. A walk-in on the left wall, 2 deck ovens on the right. The work table in the centre, polished to a smoothness that only came from being used correctly for a very long time. Diane unwrapped the loaf and set it on the board and sliced it at the kitchen counter without ceremony. She tasted the first slice without saying anything. Then she held the second slice and looked at the crumb structure before she tasted it, which told Renee she was a baker who looked before she tasted. "You made this in a home oven," she said. "Yes." "Where did you learn to do this?" Renee told her. Not all of it, not the notebook, not yet. The bakery job, the cafeteria, the experiments, the years of it. Diane listened without interrupting, which Renee took as a sign of respect. I have been running this bakery for 22 years, Diane said when she finished, and I am expanding. I need someone who can develop new recipes and run the second location when it opens. She set down the slice of bread. I think that might be you, if you want to have a real conversation about it. Renee looked at the bread on the counter. She thought about the notebook at home. She thought about the morning she had proofed that loaf standing at the kitchen counter at 5 with the light still blue outside the window, and Cora's breathing coming soft and even from the other room. And she thought about Gerald telling her she already knew, and about Tamara telling her the timing was a thing people invented to avoid being afraid. I would like to have that conversation, she said. And here is what you need to understand about what happened next, because it did not happen the way these things happen in stories where the pieces fall perfectly into place. It happened the way real things happen, slowly and with friction, and Renee earned every inch of it. She spent 6 months working with Diane before the second location existed anywhere but on paper. She kept her grocery store shifts during the transition because she needed the income, and she was not someone who burned a bridge she still needed. Her manager at the store, a steady woman named Val, who had known Renee for 3 years, had offered to keep her on part-time indefinitely. And Renee had thanked her and said she would take the part-time for now, and Val had looked at her and said, "You are going somewhere, I can tell." Renee had said she hoped so. Val had said, "Don't hope, go." She came in early on the days she worked at Whitmore's, and she stayed late, not to impress anyone, but because the work required it, and she had always been the kind of person who let the work require what it required. She learned the operation from the inside in those months, not just the recipes, but the sourcing and the scheduling, and the way Diane managed the relationship with the milling company that supplied the flour, a third-generation family business an hour south of the city that Diane had been buying from for 19 years. Renee went with Diane on one of the quarterly visits, and she sat across from the miller's daughter and listened to the conversation about protein content and stone ground versus roller milled, and what the late harvest had done to the winter wheat yield, and she asked 3 questions, all of them good ones. And the miller's daughter looked at her with the particular attention of someone who had met very few bakers who thought about flour before they thought about recipes. She brought Cora into the bakery on Saturdays sometimes, and Cora sat on a stool near the proofing station and coloured in the books she brought and ate the broken bits Renee set aside for her. Cora called the bakery the bread place and announced to her first-grade class that her mother made the best bread in the city, which Renee heard about second-hand and which made her laugh at the kitchen table for a long time. She also brought her notebook, not all at once, a page here, a recipe there. Diane was the first person outside of Renee's own hands who had ever tasted the things in that notebook, and she tasted them the way she tasted everything, without flattery and without cruelty, which was the right way. The right way did not always mean gentle. When the black sesame brioche came back with a 3-word note saying, "needs more structure," Renee spent 2 Sundays adjusting the hydration before she understood the problem, and when she brought the revised version in, Diane tasted it twice and said nothing for 15 seconds, and then said, "That one's ready," and that was all she needed. The honey wheat loaf needed another 12 minutes of bake time, a thing Diane identified in a single tasting that Renee had somehow never caught in months of testing at home, which taught her something about the difference between making something good enough for your own table and making something good enough for someone else's. The rosemary focaccia was ready from the first time she brought it in. The black sesame brioche required the revision, and then it was ready. These were the conversations they had, steady and specific, and without performance on either side, and Renee had never had them before with anyone who understood what she was talking about, and she sat with that privately, what it meant to finally be speaking the same language as someone in the same room. There was also the question of what she would be called when the second location opened. Diane had raised it carefully, in the same way she raised everything she considered important. Not a title, she said, though the title would come. A role, a function. What Renee would own. Renee had listened and said she wanted to own the recipes, meaning the development, and she wanted a voice in the sourcing, and she wanted to hire her own counterstaff at the second location. Diane had considered this and said yes to all 3, and they had written it into an agreement that a lawyer friend of Diane's had reviewed and said was straightforward, which it was, because both of them had said what they meant. The second location of Whitmore's opened on a Saturday in early October, 18 months after Diane had walked up to Renee at the day-old rack and asked her to bring something she had made. Renee was there at 4 in the morning to pull the first loaves. Cora was there at 7:30 with Renee's cousin Tamara, who had been Renee's closest friend since childhood, and who had been the first person Renee had ever shown the notebook to, years before, sitting at the kitchen table on a Thursday night while Cora slept, Renee explaining the honey wheat experiment and Tamara eating 3 pieces of it and saying, "Renee, I need you to do something with this." Renee had said the timing wasn't right. Tamara had said the timing was a thing people invented to avoid being afraid, which was probably true, and which Renee had written in the margin of the notebook that night, not as a recipe note, but as a reminder. "You did something with it," Tamara said that morning, standing in the new store with a cup of coffee and a piece of the black sesame brioche that had made the final menu after many rounds of revision. "Diane did something with it," Renee said. Tamara looked at her. "You made that loaf, not Diane." Renee thought about that. She thought about the notebook and the 5 in the morning and the ratio adjusted by 4 grams and the years before any of that. The years she'd been putting what she knew quietly into her hands. "We both did something with it," she said, and that felt right. The second location did well. Better than well. By the following spring, it had a line out the door on weekend mornings, which Renee knew was partially the product and partially the neighbourhood, which was one of those places that had been overlooked long enough that it was ready to receive something good. She had known this neighbourhood most of her life. She had shopped in it and waited for the bus in it, and driven through it on the way to every job she had ever worked. She knew which block had the best light in the afternoon, and where the foot traffic came from, and what a person in this part of the city wanted when they walked through a bakery door. She was also developing the wholesale account that Diane had asked her to pursue, which turned out to be something she was as good at as the baking. She had not expected this. She had expected to be capable at the conversation, not good at it the way she was good at bread, the way she could feel when something was working. She could explain what made one loaf different from another in terms that made sense to someone who had never thought about fermentation in their life. And she could also explain it to a restaurant buyer who knew exactly what they wanted and needed her to convince them they had not found it yet. The first account was a small dinner restaurant 6 blocks from the second location, a place that had been buying from a commercial supplier and was not happy about it. The owner, a woman named Sondra who ran the kitchen herself, had eaten at the new location 3 times before she reached out. She and Renee met on a Monday afternoon, and Renee brought 4 loaves and a sheet of figures, and Sondra tasted all 4 and asked about the seeded rye, and Renee explained the starter she had developed over 9 months, and Sondra said, "What do you need from me to make this a standing order?" They had an agreement before the coffee was finished. The second and third accounts came through Sondra's referral. The fourth and fifth she developed herself, cold calls to restaurants she had researched, places where the bread program was weak enough to be improved, and the ownership was independent enough to care about the difference. She signed 3 accounts in the first 4 months, then 5 more. By the time a year had passed, the second location was handling as much wholesale volume as the flagship, and Diane had begun to talk about the third. Renee had also, in this same year, gotten the call she had quietly been expecting. Gerald, the man who had run Hatch, had heard through a common acquaintance that she was working with Diane. He called on a Sunday evening and she stepped out onto the small balcony that was technically a fire escape and talked to him for 40 minutes while Cora watched a movie inside. He said he was glad. He said he had known she would find somewhere worthy of her skill. He had only hoped she wouldn't have to wait too long. She told him about the notebook and the 41 recipes, now 53. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That's what I thought," and she understood exactly what he meant. It was around this time that the woman in the linen jacket came back. Renee did not recognize her at first. It had been almost 2 years. The woman came into the second location on a Thursday morning, and she ordered a cappuccino and a slice of the honey wheat toast, and she ate it at one of the tables near the window, and Renee noticed her the way she noticed everyone who came in for the first time, with a kind of quiet attention that was not intrusive. It was a habit from the first months of running the counter herself before she had staff she trusted completely. You watched people to understand what they were tasting, what they were looking for, whether the thing you had made met them where they were. It was the earrings that placed her. Small gold drops, not large enough to see from across the room, but the way they caught the light was familiar. Renee remembered the linen jacket. She remembered the word that had been a closing door. She did not walk over. She filled a wholesale order in the back and came out to help with the noon rush, and saw that the woman was still there, eating a second piece of toast, looking out the window at the street. She was looking at the street the way someone looks at a thing they are trying to understand. Not with pleasure, exactly. With a kind of attention that was new to her. Renee had served enough people across enough counters to know the difference between someone eating and someone thinking while they ate, and this woman was thinking. At some point, the woman looked up and saw Renee. There was a moment where the recognition moved across her face, not comfortable. She looked at the counter, the display case, the chalk sign on the wall listing the day's loaves. She looked back at Renee. Renee was already on to the next order. She did not need anything from the woman. She did not need the apology, did not need the acknowledgement, did not need the moment to go anywhere. The woman had said what she had said in the bread aisle 2 years ago, and the world had moved forward without waiting for her to understand it. This was always how it went. The people who dismissed you did not stop being who they were. They just found themselves eventually in a room you had built. The woman left a $6 tip on a $9 order and slipped out without saying anything. Renee's counterperson brought the tip over and Renee put it in the jar and went back to work. That Thursday fell in the same week that Renee had gotten word from a development office in the city about a storefront on 5th and Elm that had become available. The lot Diane had been watching for the third location. Diane had offered to bring Renee in as a partner on the new space, a conversation that had started carefully and then grown into something more substantial across 4 months of slow, careful negotiation. They were sitting at the table in the back of the flagship on the Friday afternoon, the papers between them, and outside the window the neighbourhood was doing what it did at noon on Fridays, moving with the particular energy of people who had almost made it to the end of the week. Renee had been sitting with the papers for 3 days at this point. She had read them twice, and she had called her cousin's boyfriend, who was a paralegal, and asked him to read them too. He had called back the next morning and said, "This is exactly what you said it was. Sign it." Renee had said she would. When Renee asked the question she had been holding for a while, Diane was quiet for a moment. She set down her coffee. She looked at the papers between them as though she were about to say something she had been composing for a while. "Because I knew that look," she said. "The way you stood there, you picked up the bread the same way I used to pick up the bread. Like you already knew what you were going to make with it." Renee waited. "And I heard what you said to that woman," Diane added. "You said you had been shopping in the store for 4 years. You said it like it was the most reasonable thing in the world, because it was. And I thought, this person knows what reasonable looks like. This person is not apologizing for the math." She tapped the papers on the table. "That is who I need to build the third location with." She paused. "I also thought, if I don't say something to this woman today, I am going to regret it for a long time. I was 22 years old in an apartment not far from here, and I had a baby, and I was buying day-old bread. And someone looked at me the way that woman looked at you, and I have spent 22 years trying to build something in this neighborhood that has no room in it for that look. I have not always succeeded." She looked at the papers again. "This is another try." Renee looked at the papers. She thought about the notebook, all 41 recipes, the 12 that had since become 20 more. She thought about Cora, who was 8 now and no longer called it the bread place because she had learned the real name but still came in on Saturdays and sat on the same stool. She thought about day-old bread, not as a humiliation, as a lesson she had already known, that something labelled past its moment could still feed you, that what a person called surplus, another person's hands could turn into something nourishing, that the act of choosing carefully when your resources were thin was not a lesser act than choosing without thinking. It was a more honest one. She signed the papers. If anyone had told Renee 2.5 years before that the woman in the linen jacket would one day walk into a location that bore a title Renee had helped earn, and sit at a table Renee had chosen, and eat bread Renee had developed from a recipe in a notebook she had been keeping in her kitchen at night after her daughter fell asleep, Renee would not have found it difficult to believe. She would have nodded. She had always believed in the work. She had simply been waiting for the chance to apply it somewhere large enough. The third location of Whitmore's opened on a Saturday in March on the corner of 5th and Elm, in a building with big front windows that let in the morning light and a display case that held 42 items, all but 3 of which appeared in some form in the notebook Renee had been keeping since Cora was 2 years old. Renee was there at 3:30 in the morning to prep the first proofs. Cora was there at 7 with Tamara, who brought her own coffee this time because she knew the drill. "You know what's funny," Tamara said, standing at the window with the sun coming in. "The place that used to be where you're standing. You know what was there?" "I know," Renee said. She had looked it up. There had been a bakery on this corner 15 years ago that had closed, an independent one, well regarded for about 4 years. It had not lasted. "You're standing where it used to be," Tamara said. Renee looked at the window, at the light coming in. At the line forming on the sidewalk outside, 10 people, then 15. People from this neighbourhood who had been waiting for something that understood what they wanted. "Hand me the lame," she said. She had 3 more loaves to score before the doors opened. Cora hopped off the stool and brought her mother the scoring tool and then climbed back up and watched. She was quiet in the specific way she got quiet when she was paying close attention, chin resting on her hand, the same way she watched everything in this kitchen. "Mama," she said. "What?" "The bread smells better in here than it did in the old place." Renee scored the loaf. "New oven," she said. "No," Cora said, with the finality of someone who was 8 and had decided. "It's because you made it." Renee did not say anything. She slid the loaf in and set the timer and wiped her hands on her apron and let herself stand there for 1 moment in the light. She had bought day-old bread for 4 years, and she had made something out of every loaf. The woman in the linen jacket had said what she had said, and the world had not stopped turning on its axis. The rack at the back of the store had held what it held, and Renee had picked up what was useful and left what she did not need. There was a line outside now that went to the end of the block. The timer counted down, and Renee went back to work, and the morning light came through the windows and filled the room with the kind of warmth that does not come from an oven. Have you ever watched someone do something quietly for years and wondered if they even knew how good they were? Leave a comment and let us know. And if this story moved you, there is another one waiting right here that you are going to want to hear. This story is a work of fiction. Names, characters, and events are imaginary and created for entertainment. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is coincidental.